I've been interested in caricatures for some time, and I've got a pretty good collection of those. So I thought, maybe I'll work on that. Now, the first thing to realize is that we do it differently than the Europeans. Most European countries have a long tradition of satirical weeklies. I mean, there's, of course, Punch in England. There's Charlie Hebdo in France. The Germans have satirical weeklies going back to 1850 or so and still have a bunch of them today. We really don't have anything quite similar. New Yorker is not entirely satirical. Mad Magazine, one of the pleasures of my youth, is not quite the same thing either, aimed at a bit of a different audience. But there's this long tradition of satirical magazines, which survived under the Nazis as well. The Nazis had their own satirical magazine. In 1931, they founded something called Brennnessel, kind of stinging nettle. That survived until 1938, but it went out of business. They just didn't have enough subscribers because people basically don't like to pay good money for bad propaganda. And as a consequence, during the 30s, these subscriptions to Brennnessel steadily diminished. But the classic German humor magazines continued. Some of the Simus, Fliegende Blätter, Lustige Blätter, and so forth. And I've got a pretty good collection, and a lot of them are available online. So I thought, okay, let's take a look at World War II and Nazi cartoons. We're going to look at, initially as an introduction, the war in 6 cartoons that trace the trajectory. Then we'll look at the way the Nazis treated the combatants, then a few of the leaders, then the Jews, then German weapons, the German military, some domestic themes, what happened toward the end, and then the doom of caricature. So let's start with the war in 6 cartoons. This one is from June 1940, when the war was looking very good from the Nazi point of view. Here you've got this massive broom sweeping a cover of Lustige Blätter. And lo and behold, you've got British and French and various folks being tossed off, along with their fantasies of encirclement politics, English guarantees, central conspiracies, plans to attack Germany.
Randall, we're not seeing your screen presentation.
This is rather awkward. It's on my screen, so.
Hit share screen on the bottom.
Okay, just a minute. I may have to, sorry about that. I'm just kind of looking.
And while you're doing that, for everybody, please mute your microphones, and we can unmute at the end of the presentation for questions. At the very bottom, there's a little icon. It might be green saying share screen of the Zoom meeting.
Okay, hold on. That would help. I'm looking at Zoom. I do not see that.
Do you see that all the menu, like mute, and there's a little bottom menu bar?
I don't have a little bottom menu bar.
Really?
I'm working on a Mac. I've got a couple of different screens I'm looking at. I'm looking, let's see.
It won't be in the PowerPoint. It'll be on the Zoom screen.
Right, I'm looking at the Zoom screen.
You should have a little submenu below that says security, participants, chat, screen, share screen.
Well, I do not see that. Let me go through mute audio, video, and share screen. Bingo, it's not in different. Okay.
All right. Now
we got it now?
Yeah, got it.
Okay.
And just
okay.
Yeah. You can enlarge that, hit the green button.
Yeah.
That'll give it full screen, and then hit play and you're off and running.
Okay, hold on here. Navigator, play slideshow. Bingo.
There we go.
Okay. So sorry about that. Quick rerun. So the war in 6 cartoons, the combatants, the leaders, the Jews, German military, domestic themes, toward the end, and the end of caricature. So first of all, we look at the war in 6 cartoons that trace the progression from the German point of view. The first one, just to be sure we're seeing this, yes? Lustige Blätter?
Yep,
Seeing this one?
yep.
Okay, great. This is the June 1940 cartoon, and you can see the German broom is sweeping away English guarantees and encirclement policies and secret plans, and the French and the British and the Jews and Winston Churchill and so forth. The war was kind of a cheerful business for the cartoonists in June of 1940. In September of 1940, this is a cartoon from the party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, in September during the Blitz. And as you can see, again, it's a little grimmer, but it's kind of optimistically grim, at least for the Germans. New music over Westminster, okay? And death is using its sword to play some sort of tune on a bomb. Again, the British deserved it. They were getting what was coming to them for their evil plans. The war was still kind of a cheerful and optimistic event. But now let's jump a couple of years. This is February of 1943, after Stalingrad. And now the tone of the caricatures has changed. We've got a rather nasty looking red-starred Russian with a couple of babies that are clearly not in the best of shape. Things are looking grim. The threat from the steppes. Things improved a little bit by later in 1943. The Germans kind of recovered a bit. There seemed to be some hope. And one of the German propaganda themes in 1943 was 1943 is not 1918. 1943 does not equal 1918. And what they meant by that was that although Germany allegedly had collapsed in 1918, just short of victory, stabbed in the back by traitors and all of the rest, 1943 was different. The Germans had learned their lesson, and the old propaganda line that worked in 1918 doesn't work anymore. So here we've got the 1918 old vehicle. Uncle Sam was driving it. The British and the Russians are pushing it. The Jew is in the back seat with his dull slogan, freedom for the European peoples. None of them look very happy because their old propaganda strategies of 1918 aren't working anymore. Kind of a temporary burst of optimism. And now we go from the offensive to the defensive. This is a 1943 cartoon in which you've got the European wall with the various flags of Nazi puppets, and enemy agitation is trying to find a crack or a chink in the wall. But since it's such a firm and strong wall, lo and behold, there is just no way. Germany is safe. But note that this is a defensive rather than an offensive position. Germany is under attack. And now we get to later in 1944, his way to liberate Europe. You've got this nasty beast carrying a bomb with murder on it. We've got an American flag, a British flag, the Russian star, the Star of David. And this nasty beast is on its way to liberate Europe. So you can see that the trajectory of these 6 cartoons shows an initial optimism, some concern, then more optimism, and now we're back to, uh-oh, we're in trouble. Well, how were the Japanese treated? When Pearl Harbor came along, of course, the Germans were delighted because it looked like they had another powerful ally. As Hitler said, somebody who had never been defeated. So here we have a Lustige Blätter front cover from January, just shortly after Pearl Harbor, in which the samurai sword defeated the big mouth. Lo and behold, Franklin Roosevelt is having a little bit of trouble with that Japanese sword going through his tongue and neck and gullet. Here we have a similar cartoon a couple of weeks later. Churchill and Roosevelt are talking. They're saying, but we only wanted to give them eternal peace. Whereas, of course, the noose that they'd intended to use to hang Japan has been sliced by the samurai sword. What about Italy? Now, Italy is an interesting event. The Germans were never too enthused about their Italian allies. I did a piece some years back on cartoons in the 1930s. And Dartmouth University has a wonderful set of volumes in its special collections. It turns out that one of their graduates was in the army that marched into Munich, and he visited the headquarters of Brennnessel, which was that Nazi magazine I mentioned, which went bankrupt, and found their archives, including their draft versions, which went to some kind of censor. And Italian cartoons got censored because you can find the proofs of what they intended, and then the actual published issue after the censor had said, no, you can't. For instance, one cartoon censored showed a rather dumpy looking Italian soldier saying that he thinks he's like his Roman forebears. Well, they didn't have that. And so, given that there were not always tremendous enthusiasm for Italian military achievements, the number of Italian cartoons I found during World War II was 0. There probably were a few somewhere, but essentially I didn't find any caricatures of the Italians, so we can skip past them. What about England? Well, England was eventually first viewed as kind of not much of a threat. This is a full page of cartoons from the Nazi Party Illustrated Weekly, the Illustrator Beobachter, in November, just after the war started. The Lion Has Wings, it says. A film by someone was made in London about a, quote, air attack on Kiel. The idea is that they've got the studio in London in which they are filming the supposed attack on Kiel with vast devastation. The British are pretty good at making films, the cartoon suggests, but you really wouldn't worry too much about their military prowess. The same theme, this is from August 1940. You've got someone sitting in his London club, world ruler John Bull, and he's saying, take the globe away, I can't look at it any longer. The British are simply in trouble. Their empire is collapsing. Booted off, this is January 1941. Europe with a Nazi flag is steaming away, and John Bull with his tattered Union Jack on a small boat is sitting there with a Jew, and neither of them are very happy. They've been left behind while Europe is steaming forward. Again, the non-entities, those English, aren't too much of a threat. And of course, the English are optimistic. This cartoon from early 1941, February, says, optimism. Hey, victory is ours. The king has found another four-leaf clover. What you'd expect of the English. Their cities are in ruins, but nonetheless, they're maintaining that stiff upper lip. They're worried about those nasty Germans. This is from Fliegende Blätter, one of the other weekly news magazines, May of 1942. Even in London streets, the Coast Watch has been strengthened. Who knows what those Germans might do? So looking down that manhole to see if the Germans are somehow sneaking in from a cross-channel tunnel they've managed to build or something. But the British were still good at lying propaganda. This is November of 1942. A duck is the German kind of metaphor for what we'd call fake news. And so England is full of ducks quacking fake news, and one duck is flying above, and his pack says, news at the second front. He says, no time, I have to rush to Moscow to console Stalin. So again, the British are good at talking, good at lying, but you really don't have to worry too much about them. What about the Russians? Well, here's the first Russian cartoon, and this one, the Russians are actually a little bit disappointed, okay? Beaten to the punch. According to this, July 1941, the Jew in England is planning on releasing the Russian bear at the right moment. But as you can see, the German soldier kicks him on the snout first, and the Jew says, I wasn't ready to let him go yet. Stalin, after the offensive. This is 1942, after the failure of the Germans to take Moscow, the Russian counteroffensive, which was eventually slowed. And the argument is that Stalin's offensive didn't accomplish very much except lots of bodies. Stalin says, oh, nothing happened. And the Graves, you call this nothing, Father Stalin? Here's a rather optimistic cartoon from September of 1942, hanging by a silk thread. You can see that Stalin is holding on to Stalingrad, but the Nazi scissors is about to cut through it. Again, an optimistic presentation. I kind of was amused by this one. This is June 1943. Apparently, there had been an effort to get Americans to write encouraging letters to the Russians. And this one says, Ivan Georgievich is most deeply impressed by the lovely letter from the USA. And of course, he's heading to the outhouse where he'll find it useful as toilet paper. What about the United States? Well, again, the Germans had a mixed reaction to the United States. They both admired it. Of course, it had been built primarily by great Germans, as they would like to point out. But on the other hand, well, those Americans are full of hot air. This is early in the American entry. This is about March of 1942. And you've got this inflated engine Roosevelt with Stalin hoping for the best. But the conductor says, yeah, Stalin, if noise or power, the engine would not be bad after all. The Americans, in short, are full of hot air. And like the British, you don't have to worry about them too much. Here's another one on the same theme, American giganticism. Isn't it wonderful? The motor is so powerful that it flies all by itself, saving us the airplane and pilots. Okay, so yeah, maybe those Americans can build things, but guess what? It's really not much of a threat. And this is, of course, 1942, before the full effort of the American war production is beginning to make its impact felt. On the same theme, Roosevelt, Churchill and company, they're cranking out ships plunging into the water for the waiting submarine sharks. Churchill says, I don't believe, Roosevelt, that we'll hold out longer than the German U-boats. So yeah, maybe the Americans can produce a lot, but guess what? We can sink it faster than they can produce it. Every now and then they'd pick up on an American article they found amusing. And this one is from the illustrator Beobachter, again, a full page collection of cartoons, School for Draft Dodgers. In a New York hotel, a Jew opened a since closed school for draft dodgers. And the various cartoons, show how you could pretend to be scrawny, or the bottom right suggests that you can pretend to be a homosexual, various ways showing that, again, the Americans just really, they're not the best soldiers. And again, we don't have to worry too much about them. By 1944, there was a little more concern about the Americans and an attempt to show that they're really not very nice. So here you got the American Uncle Sam standing on England, the new base, or the new strong point. And Uncle Sam is smirking because he's making a whole lot of money while John Bull is in trouble. By this time, the American air impact was being felt. And here we have a cartoon of a crook who's being led to the electric chair. What is your last wish, the reporter says. I'd like to bomb one more church. The idea is that he was a former pilot and he had been bombing not military targets in Germany, but cultural landmarks, churches, and so forth. And his great regret is that he just didn't get a chance to bomb enough. This is the same theme from from August 1944, which also has the racist theme. Hey, bimbo, look at the funny factories they have here in Europe. The idea is that the blacks were, not stupid, inferior raced, being exploited and used by the American military, but they had no idea what culture was. They were stupid enough to think that churches or museums were factories. On the other hand, every now and then, the Nazis decided they might have some useful advice for the United States on racial relations. So this cartoon from 1943 says, in the United States, a monument to Negroes has been proposed. And the argument was, well, here's our proposal. Why don't you adopt a nice lynching metaphor and have a statue showing a black being lynched by General Lynch? That's the proposal of the Germans. What about Adolf Hitler? Now, images of Adolf Hitler were very carefully controlled. Hoffman had kind of a monopoly, and you didn't find candid shots of Adolf Hitler. There were things that pretended to be, but of course they're very carefully chosen. There were a very few caricatures of Hitler in the early 30s. But after that, they pretty much disappeared. And during the war, Hitler, like Italy, was zip, zero, and nada. I could not find any cartoons showing Adolf Hitler during the war years. There may have been one or two, but the Fuhrer by this time was too much of a semi-god figure to reduce the stature in any way by drawing cartoons or caricatures of him. Winston Churchill. The Nazis liked Winston Churchill. He was easy to caricature. Here's a January 1940 cartoon in which Churchill is boxing and he says, damn, the punching bag fights back. The world just isn't going the way that he would like it to go. Here you've got Churchill spreading those lies. We're winning already, he says, spreading filth, dreck. Well, of course, England is being bombed in the background. This is after the Blitz has begun. Or how about the philosophy of the madman, November of 1940? Churchill is saying, our empire is so large that it hardly matters if a small island burns down. Churchill is just getting what he deserves. Now, of course, their perspective is going to change a little bit once German cities start being leveled. But at this stage, England is being leveled, and that's what it deserves. Meanwhile, Hitler is making lies. This is June 1942, and it says, careful, don't disturb him. He's trying to hold England together by promises, with a liveried servant in the background holding more lies to be able to pound in to hold the promises together. So again, the English are kind of not really worth fighting all that much about, and Churchill is a buffoon. Joseph Stalin. We've already seen a few of Stalin, and the first cartoon I'm going to show you actually shows Stalin in a favorable light. But look at the date. Just before the war began, after the German-Soviet Pact, August 1939. And you've got France and England looking over the map of Europe. The French are saying, we'll come from the west. And the British are saying, we will come over the ocean. And Stalin is saying, and we won't come at all. Non-aggression pact with Germany. This, I think, is about the only favorable cartoon of Stalin that I've come across. The problem with Stalin was that for years announcing that the Russians were evil souls in the pay of the Jews, it was kind of awkward being allied with them. So the alliance was welcomed, but not a whole lot was said about it. But of course, once the attack on Russia began in 1941, things changed a whole lot. And the basic argument was that Stalin was the motivating force behind the alliance, and of course, he was controlled by the Jews. So here we have the evening prayers in Washington. This is modeled after a standard kid's bedtime prayer in German, but it says, I am small, my heart is pure, let no one dwell within but Stalin alone, with a particularly unpleasant looking caricature of Eleanor Roosevelt as well, who really seems to be quite larger and taller than either her husband or our friend Winston Churchill. Here, Stalin is breaking his teeth on the results of his winter offensive. He bit into steel. Here we've got Stalin as the puppet master. Note what's going on. He's controlling Roosevelt and Churchill, and they in turn are controlling smaller puppets. They believe they are the puppeteers, that is Churchill and Roosevelt, but in fact, they are the real puppets, the cartoon says, although actually, of course, from the Nazi point of view, the Jews were even pulling Stalin's strings. The argument about D-Day was that it was a March disaster. Stalin was ordering it. So here we've got July 1944, and lo and behold, Stalin is ordering the two Allied leaders to march into the depths and into their destruction. Franklin Roosevelt. Now, in the early 1930s, the Nazis kind of liked Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, I've gone through their press directives, and until about 1935 or 1936, they instructed the press to say nice things, to be gentle. And there are some favorable cartoons about Roosevelt. But once Roosevelt became a little less friendly, they quickly changed their minds. And by his quarantine speech in 1937, the Nazis realized he was a bad guy. So first of all, they made an argument that Roosevelt was in it for the good of the United States. So here's a 1941 cartoon before the United States got into the war. We've got a fairly cheerful looking Roosevelt. And what is he doing? He's clipping the hide of the British lion, Jamaica and Guyana and so forth, the old Lend-Lease kinds of things. So the argument here is that the United States is just having a fine old time exploiting England. The lion has to get a haircut. But later on, this is still before we got into the war, Roosevelt is portrayed in a much less friendly way. Here he's rather an ugly looking, decrepit, almost half dead, on crutches. And the argument is his New Deal has failed. Roosevelt needs new ways to support himself. So he's doing that by establishing bases on Iceland and the Azores. And this is still before the war, by the way. This is, we got in November 1941. The gangster president, the presidential chair on which he belongs. It's a rather bad caricature of Roosevelt, actually, but what do you say? By 1942, the United States was in the war, and of course, Nazi ideology required that Roosevelt be a tool of the Jews. So here we have a cartoon in which he's standing on an American flag with his cane, holding up a candelabra with the Jewish star, of course, and the flames seem to have gone out. Doesn't seem to be going very well. In 1944, when the Democrats decided, I guess, to go after Roosevelt again for the candidacy, the Nazis commented, "A donkey remains a donkey." The donkey is saying, "Please tread on me for 4 more years, dictator." Interesting use of the word dictator there. But in any event, Roosevelt is still not a very good guy. What about the Jews? Now, of course, the Nazis hated the Jews with a passion and blamed the Jews for just about everything, including the war. And in some ways, they viewed the war as a welcome opportunity to reckon with the Jews. Here is a front cover from Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer, just after the war began. The Devil's Hope, but the cartoon is titled The Reckoning. You've got the strong German, and now it's going to be possible to deal with the Jews. Here's a slightly later cartoon, still 1939, The Storm Year, 1940. The tidal wave is engulfing the drowning Jew with the Star of David. Now, they still tended to view Jews optimistically at this stage of the war. Here we have May of 1940. These are incompetent, inept Jews, not the deadly dangerous Jews we'll see shortly. They're flying on this old biplane, and they're trying to catch the dove of peace. Cartoon says, plutocratic dove hunting. Stop them, kill them. When they land in Europe, bad things happen to us, the caption says. So, these are not terribly dangerous looking Jews because the Germans are confident they're going to win and they'll be able to reckon with these Jews. But the Jews are still behind everything, behind the curtains. This cartoon from 1942 says, you've got a bunch of previous Jewish puppets shattered in the ground, and the Jew is looking rather dubiously at Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. They don't seem to be much better than the ones that already worked, but the Jews are behind it. That's made more evident in this 1943 cartoon. Note that the Jew is a little nastier looking here. The caption says, one devours the Jew and the Jew devours them all. The Jew is eating the Russian, who's eating the United States, who's eating the British lion. The Jews are no longer funny anymore. They're deadly. Another 1943 cover from Stryker's Der Stürmer. Human murderers from the beginning, the devil's plan. Again, a malevolent-looking Jew looking at a map of Europe where folk are being led off in chains as the Jews are attempting to dominate the world. Here's another one, 1943, late 1943. Nailed down, Star of David, and you've got the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans and Central Americans, the British and so forth, the French, they're all nailed to the Jewish star. 1944, the bacterium, the circle of Judah. And you've got the caricature of an ugly Jew lighting the world on fire. The Jews are now in no way amusing. They're deadly. And of course, what do you do with the bacterium? You kill it, you get rid of it, which is, of course, the Nazi plan, which by 1944 had already killed millions upon millions of people. Well, let's jump a little bit to the German military and see what was done presenting Germans. Now, first of all, we're going to look at a cartoon that is not German. You'll recognize the style, the modeling, and the Nazis never would have published this cartoon. It says, fresh-spirited American troops, flushed with the victory, are bringing in thousands of hungry, ragged, battle-weary prisoners, a news item. Now, of course, what this cartoon does is it shows a weary American guarding some German prisoners. He's as worn down and exhausted as they are. And note that it's a little bit of a criticism of the American news media. Does our soldier look fresh-spirited, flushed with victory? No, he doesn't. One of the things that made these cartoons, of course, so popular was that they projected the reality of war. And that is something that you wouldn't do as Germans. The German soldiers were always tough, handsome, strong-looking, confident, going from victory unto victory. You'd never see a German soldier looking like this. Instead, you might see things like this. This is February of 1942, after the Russian counteroffensive. He dashes against the wall in vain. You've got these enormous German marching boots charging, and Stalin, of course, hasn't got the faintest hope of stopping them. Sometimes you had optimistic views of the German military. Here we have a March 1942 cartoon, German U-boats off New York. Again, this group will know that that was the happy time for German U-boats. They were cruising off the American coast, cities were illuminated, and they could just pick off passing freighters right and left. Well, here you've got German U-boats in New York, and Roosevelt is saying, damn, lies won't help anymore. We're going to have to admit something, as American ships are sinking right and left. U-boats were a favorite target. This is August of 1942. And lo and behold, Uncle Sam's teeth are being yanked out by the U-boat pinchers. Here we've got the rule of the ocean bottom. Neptune says, from our point of view, the Americans seem to control more of the ocean than the British. I'm not sure how much good that coffee is going to do Neptune, given soggy and so forth, but nonetheless, Germans would have maybe taken some sadistic pleasure in thinking that all that coffee that they didn't have, the British didn't have either, because it was at the bottom of the ocean in Neptune's hands. Here's a somewhat lighthearted U-boat cartoon. The Outsider, when the new arrival is asked, torpedo or bomb? Says neither, the storm. For some reason, the ships seem remarkably cheerful about being sunk, but what do you say? Now, this is one of the last U-boat cartoons. In fact, it may be the last major one I found. The U-boat, the German Magnet, is pulling ships down. Now, the reason it's the last is that if you look at the date, May of 1943, and again, this group will realize that May of 1943 was the month that changed the tide. At that point, all of the Allied countermeasures finally began to take effect, and German U-boats began to sink and be destroyed at an astonishing rate. And after that, it was hard to make propaganda about the successes of German U-boats. But then, a little bit later, along came the V weapons, which, from the German point of view, gave them temporary hope. This one says, a much invited guest. Have I found the inventor of bombing terror? The idea is that the English are getting back exactly what they deserved. They've been bombing the Germans. Guess what? It's their turn. In this case, Reuters reports with clockwork precision, the robots hammer day and night on southern England. Again, causing delight that the British are getting what they were giving the Germans. Still one more. How unfair! Out of the air. You know, the Germans are descending upon the British from the air with their unfair rocket bombs. Well, what about domestic caricatures? Most, by the way, of the content of these magazines was domestic caricatures or jokes, humorous articles, and so forth. Because if they filled it full of, just propaganda, people would stop buying it. So the majority of content was more innocuous. You could still print most of the jokes today. A large part of it was cheesecake. So, for instance, here you've got a comely young woman saying, my unknown soldier writes that he dreams of me every night. Just to be sure, I'll send him a photograph. I'm not sure if I can rely on his dreams, okay? These typically were, dressed or semi-undressed women, and they were after a good husband. They met all the caricatures of the good German wife. Here's another one. You can't put into words how much you love me? Well, there are other ways. And again, just about every issue of the satirical weeklies had at least one or two cartoons like this. Then they worked at diminishing behaviors that they didn't like gossiping, rudeness, or talking too much. So, for instance, they were worried about information slipping out. Of course, in the Allies, the same thing happened. A slip of the lip can sink a ship, things like that. So here's a 1943 cover from Lustige Blätter, and a donkey is telling them all, hey, have you heard? Or here you've got 1944, they ran a campaign against gossiping. Psst, that was the name of the campaign. And what you've got here are Germans who are talking too much and endangering the war effort. This is part of the 1944 campaign as well. Soldier on leave is talking to his comely young lass and says, these new guns have a caliber of, hey, hush hounds, no one may hear that. And it's a good thing she says that, because of course you can see the shadow of a dangerous enemy spy behind it. So there was an attempt to keep people from talking. Then there was an effort to encourage courtesy. Does it have to be this way? This cartoon says. You've got a plump guy who's saying, if I didn't need a vacation so badly, he's charged into an overfull railway compartment, plopped down, squeezing other people. He doesn't really need to go on vacation, okay? But he thinks he does, and other people need to travel even more. So you had cartoons like that. Then there were things about rationing and hoarding. Here is a cartoon of our two cheerful young ladies, and one is showing her new dress. How many ration points did it cost? Her friend says, none. Good God, Paula, did you cheat? Oh, not at all. I made it for one of my old 4-year-old dresses. An hilarious cartoon, I'm sure you'll agree. But, it suggested that you had to work within the rationing system. But some people didn't. This was from the Austrian part of the Reich, part of a campaign on late 1941. A very unpleasant guy named Herr Semperer, and he complained so loudly. The trains, you see, are sometimes late. And such times, how can he then himself punctually fill his sack by wandering around the countryside and buying black market eggs and beef and things like that? This is the kind of guy, well-fed, plump, stuffed with the goodies that he doesn't really need. And he's complaining because it's hard to violate the rationing regulations. Here we've got the hoarder has a nightmare. He's got all kinds of eggs and other such stuff. Hams hanging from his bed, mice are nibbling on some of it, but he's worried because he realizes that if he's caught, he might find himself executed. And in fact, the Nazis did execute some folk who were guilty of hoarding. And the complainers. The complainers can never stop. In this case, the sandman is dripping sand over the eyes of a kid to put him to sleep, but the father comes in and says, "Hey, be careful. Haven't you heard that sand is in short supply?" How ridiculous it is to complain that you can't get everything you want, the cartoon suggests. And here we have another cartoon page on the hoarding theme. The one to the upper left shows a guy who thought that he could get what he wanted with schnapps and cigarettes, but he got a somewhat different reception from the shopkeeper who kicked him out of her shop, as you can see. And the other cartoons are in the same kind of theme. Lower right shows the guy who's exploiting things, but as you can see, he's got the sword of Damocles hanging over his head, and his life is at some risk. Then there was the campaign against the Kohlenklau, the coal thief. These ran in just about every German newspaper and magazine during the period as a kind of caricature. And this one says, "A coal thief will be chased out of the bathtub. It may be comfortable," it says, to sink up to your nose in warm bath water and shower and so forth and fill it up with hot water occasionally. But that's too much like what coal thief likes. Have to be clean, of course, and got to scrub the body, and but a half tub of water is certainly enough. And it goes on to exchange how to save money and save energy and don't help the coal thief go about his nefarious business. Well, what about the end? The Nazis kept, of course, asserting victory, but after Stalingrad, it became increasingly a possibility. This is the cartoon just after Stalingrad, before Goebbels' famous total war speech, February 4th. They died that Germany might live. Stalingrad calls to action. This clearly suggests that things are really grim now. I mean, there's a possibility, only loosely hinted at, but there's a possibility that the war could take a bad turn. So instead of sitting comfortably in your easy chair, it's much more important to produce those tanks. Get to work. This is after Goebbels' total war speech. And here is one of the more interesting cartoons. This is, again, a little after Stalingrad. And it says, "If the homeland's courage fails, this is how Germany will look." In short, the war could end. We could end up looking like this unless we all get together and work. Well, we've seen cartoons through 1944, and September of 1944 essentially marked the end of caricature and cartooning in Germany. We already saw this cartoon, His Way to Liberate Europe. And the reason that happened is that as Germany increasingly faced resource problems and lack of manpower, increasingly things were cut back. By 1944, newspapers were down to maybe 4 pages. And by 1945, sometimes just one sheet printed on both sides. Increasingly, shops were closed, unessential things, production was curbed. And in August, September of 1944, that hit the publishing industry. A vast range of German magazines ended publication in late 1944. This one is from Fliegende Blätter. We've seen quite a few cartoons from it. And it says, "To our friends and readers, As a result of the press concentration measures required by total war, our magazine will cease publication for the remainder of the war on 30 September 1944. Resources will thus be made available for military and armaments manufacturing. We thank your readers and our readers and friends for their proven loyalty over the years. With confident faith in victory, we hope that we can supply our magazine to all readers in the usual way after victory, which was the standard German line. After victory, things will get back to normal. And so the satirical magazines disappeared, and newspapers had very few cartoons after fall of 1944. I think the practical reason for that was that, as I said, with newspapers down to 2 to 4 pages and magazines greatly cut back, the space was needed for print rather than illustrations. But in any event, by fall of 1944, the German caricature industry had pretty much gone out of business. Well, that's what I have to say.